Hey friends, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today to have Nathan, Digital Gnosis. What's up, Nathan? How you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. Obviously, because there isn't a live audience because we're recording now, it's a bit sort of strange to be talking to, like an audience without seeing chats in it. Like I think I personify the chats on the side where I'm kind of like, oh, hi guys, or whatever, when, really it's just little blocks of text, or whatever. But yeah, hello, future audience.
Hello, people from the future that will be watching this on Monday, April 18th or Tuesday, April
Yeah.
19th or whenever I upload this video. Right now it's Saturday. But today we're just going to be talking with Nathan about like Christianity and apologetics and just kind of like his views and things. So Nathan, do you want to talk a little bit about like who you are and like what you do to get things started?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a bit about my background as well, because I think that could
Mm-hmm.
be relevant perhaps to
For
your
sure.
audience being an apologetics channel. So I'm not someone who was raised in Christianity, and I'm not. Yeah, I wasn't really exposed to it at all, except through the kind of cultural Christianity that there is in UK schools. And you could argue that that still is pretty influential because like singing hymns about which contain theology in the hymns, in primary school, or learning like about the parables of Jesus in morning assemblies. I mean, that's potentially a significant amount of information at a relatively impressionable stage in your life. But I became a Christian when I was about 19, 19 to 20. And that was kind of the result of the Jordan Peterson phenomena, his kind of rise to fame and popularity, which brought to my attention a bunch of issues that I hadn't really thought about before. I think the first time, I mean, Christianity became a kind of live option for me through some of the I think probably through Peterson's his psychological explanation or understanding of the biblical series of lectures that he
Mm-hmm.
gave. And then I think the first exposure that I had to Christian philosophy was actually probably the debate he did with William Lane Craig and Rebecca Goldfarb, I think her name is.
Yeah, it sounds right.
Steven Pinker's wife, I think she is. But yeah, that was the first time I really listened to anyone like Craig or a Christian philosopher, really make the case for a kind of a certain version of Christianity as opposed to Peterson's kind of tentative. I kind of like the myths and the stories, and there's meaning in them and so forth. Um, yeah, so and the first real Christian book I read then was actually Augustine's Confessions as well. That had quite a profound impact on me, particularly the kind of biographical account and some of the things that I was experiencing and struggling with in life at the time. I joined a Christian community in a Bible study. I adopted the kind of beliefs that they had over time, became a full-blown Christian. I was a Christian for about 3 or so years, and in that time, I'd be attending church regularly, going to Bible studies as frequently as I could. I even did evangelism during like my holiday from work, for example. I took a week off and went to a different town, and we spent every day like on the street talking to people about Christianity and so forth. And then I ended up deconverting from Christianity. That's probably about 2.5 to 3 years ago now. I might not be 100% accurate in that timeline, but and throughout the time since I've kind of deconverted, I've well, it's not like a switch just changed to something. I didn't believe in Christianity, but my kind of beliefs have just kind of modified, and things have come in, things have dropped out. Like it seemed more like a kind of atheism at certain points. It seemed more like an agnosticism at certain points. But whatever it's been, it hasn't really been the same sort of Christianity. I mean, when I felt most sympathy towards Christianity, it's been in a very anti-realist sense, but potentially closer to what someone like Jordan Peterson kind of talks about. But so that's a bit of background about me, and then I've got a YouTube channel where, I mean, I just kind of do things for fun, but I also occasionally interview scholars and philosophers on there about various topics where I have more serious interviews. Sometimes I'll make videos which are just kind of critiques of things that I see going wrong in apologetics. I've got like the Bad Apologetics series where James Fodor and I go quite in depth on talking about issues with arguments, but also issues with the kind of context that the arguments are being presented in, issues with the sort of power structures and things and society, so sociological phenomena that kind of underlie certain things in apologetics. And so that's probably the most explicitly like anti-apologetics thing that I do. And other than that, I have like a lot of open conversations and hangouts with people and things on my YouTube channel.
That's good stuff. And one of the things I really appreciate about you, Nathan, and one of the reasons that I have you on is it seems like through your journey you've always been like very open. I remember thinking, I think it was over the summer or sometime in the fall, someone shared with me this blog post that you wrote, just kind of showing you like when you seemed like you were maybe like one of your points where you're more sympathetic towards Christianity. You're like, hey, this apologetic stuff, kind of garbage still. A lot of these people that are making these arguments, still not convinced, but like the moral appeal of Christianity in the sense of like purpose or something like that. And I'm just like spitballing, trying to remember this post. Like there's something there for you, and you're like agnostic Christian, something like that. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about you is your openness. Because I think sometimes on like the YouTube realm of things, we'd like to be like the super confident people, like, hey, I got this figured out, I got all my answers, I got my whole like philosophy figured out, and everyone disagrees with me, like they're just wrong, bro. They don't know my arguments. So one thing I just really appreciate about you, and I think can be translated to like my audience, maybe people from your side that might listen to this, is that there's just beauty in realizing like that we don't have all the answers. And I feel the same way. Like there's a lot of things I'm still trying to figure out, and I just wanted to say that I really appreciate that about you. So yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, now let's. I have to find something really mean to say. I just don't have anything.
Yeah, right.
I can't be so nice. Maybe it'd be helpful then, Nathan, at this point, talk about like what are your current views towards Christianity? Like, where are you
Sure.
maybe like epistemically on like things like God's existence and like the resurrection, and where do you feel like maybe like the like you talked about like the Peterson kind of view towards it? Like, where are you right now with regards to Christianity?
I mean, I certainly, I just use the word certainly, so I don't know what, cash that out however you want. But I certainly don't think Christianity is true in this kind of realist sense that someone like an evangelical, like what, William Lane Craig, or a Catholic like Trent Horn or someone would sort of claim to know that God exists, perhaps, or believe that God exists with this super high degree of confidence. For me, it's the realist sense. I just kind of can't get that to work. Like there's either too many problems, or it doesn't do anything. So I don't really understand why I would think it was true. I still, though, I immensely kind of value religion and its place in people's lives and what it does. Live options for me in terms of Christianity would be more in the kind of Christian mysticism tradition, which doesn't try so much to flesh out its theology in terms of cognitive content of doctrines that makes a ton of sense, but it's kind of like, well, a lot of this is just a mystery, and it's more about the role that Christianity can play in your life. It's more about the kind of character reform perhaps that you go through, and relating to God in that way, and that remains a sort of live option for me. But I do I mean, I still view religion through a kind of naturalist lens, right, which for me doesn't delegitimize either Christianity or Islam or anything else. I mean, I'm going to disagree when Christians and Muslims try to kind of attach metaphysical theories to the kind of things that we see taking place. But I think like the kind of activities that Christians engage in, whether it's the rituals that are involved, whether it's kind of like the community, or finding meaning in religious texts and trying to read that into your life to make sense of things, or figure out correct conduct for your life, or to get support to try and be a better person, like those things I think are very important. And so I would say someone kind of like praying through a difficult time or whatever, even though I wouldn't say there's anything like metaphysically occult or spooky going on from my point of view, is still almost just as important as it could be on a from a Christian's perspective. So that maybe that fleshes out my position a little bit. But yeah, a lot of the metaphysics of so, like some of the people you'll interview, I guess, on here, it just doesn't really get off the ground for me. I just don't see it as live option is a word that I've kind of used, or I just don't see it as well motivated for the kind of structure of beliefs that I currently have.
Mm-hmm. So would you say, like, if I asked you anything, would you say that maybe you like epistemically are like atheistic, agnostic? Like, do you have like a label that you kind of like put on yourself?
I tend to say agnostic, but I don't say that. I don't think that these words fall under sort of strict and precisely defined kind of categories. So I think I tend to say agnostic to do a few things. Like I want it to show, firstly, that I'm not being like completely dogmatic, for example, in my unbelief, or that I can be like more friendly towards what the theist or the religious person is kind of going to put forward and explore those ideas. I think those are two things that I want to say by agnostic. And I also don't want to make the claim that it couldn't be the case that God exists or anything like that. I want to make it clear that most of my pronouncements really just are about my own belief structure, and not that much more. I'm relatively I have a relatively low confidence in my capacity to pronounce like grand statements about the structure of all of reality or something like that. And so like I quite like Paul Draper's distinction between kind of like local positions and global positions when he talks about like local atheism or local agnosticism. And I think I could fall in those camps, but I might say I'm an atheist sometimes to some people, though. If I get the sense that they're particularly dogmatic, or it's going to be almost like a trigger word to people who talk about new atheists, for example, in a pejorative manner, I might kind of say, well, I'm an atheist or something, just in order to kind of mess with them a bit, which doesn't sound, but it's to kind of draw out that I think that perhaps the way that they're stereotyping people by using this label of new atheist. That I think if I can have like a pleasant conversation with someone and go, yeah, I'm a new atheist, then it can kind of put them on the back foot a bit and make them reevaluate some of those stereotypes, which can sometimes be useful for having a productive conversation. So I mean, I use different labels in different contexts, but yeah, I'm broadly going to fall within like agnosticism and atheism, or I might even fall within like anti-realist theology of some kind, because like I said, I still find value in the kind of rituals and ceremonies and so forth.
So I'd be curious then, Nathan, thinking about a statement, like for example, if I I'm a Christian, as British people say, I'm a Christian. So like I would say like I believe that God exists. So would you say then, Nathan, like you don't believe God exists? You're just kind of like not sure. Do you think it's just like maybe not, but all the apologetics kind of stuff trying to argue for God isn't really very good? So like we're kind of you like looking at it from maybe like a more like apologetic or like philosophical lens on like looking at like the question of the existence of God.
Yeah, at the moment, I would answer that I don't think that's the case, right? And I think that's heavily dependent on the mood that I'm in. So sometimes when I'm feeling more sentimental or maybe even more upset, right, I might find value in going to a church service. And part of participating in the church service might mean like reading the creed or something. I say like, I believe in God, but I view what's going on there as kind of in a non-cognitivist sense. It's more about participating in the ritual, and it's kind of like enjoying a good poem or something, right, rather than about expressing the content. And this is where I think there's kind of like, at least for me, when I say like that anti-realist version of Christianity that you could sometimes be labeled under, there's a kind of distinction between what actually takes place that we're trying to describe and the kind of metaphysical theories that people want to attached to what's going on behind the scenes there. And so yeah, when it comes to like doing the metaphysics game and talking about theories, right, I'm pretty much I think I'm pretty consistently going to disagree with like realist theories of Christianity that try to attach like the content of God existing to me taking that action or whatever. But so someone who takes like a non-cognitivist view of religious language or something else, I mean, they could be on board with plausibly even calling me a Christian when I'm in those moods, right? But like I say, the past few months, I'm sort of not of that persuasion currently. So it's not like one. It's not just this binary switch in my view. There's kind of a lot of weird things that go on around religious belief and conversion and deconversion.
Well, it's definitely tricky. Like thinking, especially for you, Nathan, having a non-Christian background, but then like becoming a Christian and then deconverting. So like you've definitely had a lot of like experiences that have shaped you. So when you're interacting with the realm of like apologetics and philosophy and things like this, there's a lot of factors at play. And obviously our emotional state's super vital. Like there's some days where I'm like super confident that God exists, and other days where I'm like, man, I don't know, this is tough. So like I totally understand that where you're at. So maybe it'd be helpful then. You spent a lot of time, James Feder. You have your Bad Apologetics series, which is a lot of fun to listen to. I've listened to there'd be a few of those. Like I'd work like over the summers when I'm not in university, and I'm just like have like an 8-hour work day. I'm like, well, put it on 1.5 speed and get a whole episode done in a whole day. So you spend a lot of time critiquing apologetics. So what is your current view, Nathan, with regards to like the nature of like apologetics?
Yeah, I quite dislike apologetics. And I think it undermines true religion in my opinion. My view is that a lot of apologetics arises. I mean, and this is actually something that Cameron Bertuzzi himself has recently come to the realization of. I think when he made the video, like the biggest mistakes that apologists make, he made some of the same points that I would make in criticizing apologists. I don't think he kind of brings it all together in the same way that kind of I would. But the criticism would be that a lot of apologetics is basically performative. It's kind of like a kind of philosophical or intellectual drag that someone dresses up in to kind of make their religion appear rational in a particular kind of way. So I think that true religion is something that kind of, it's really kind of sincere and heartfelt. When people, if you listen to people's conversion testimonies, for example, the kind of stories that they'll tell about the reasons that they convert for, in general, I mean, not everyone. There's obviously going to be some outliers, who will have converted for purely intellectual reasons. But in general, it's going to be things like, going through a really tough period in their life, and God was the thing that kind of pulled them through that in some sense. Or a Christian community came into their life, and they started they started realizing the message of Christ and how that could do work for them. And I think that kind of what happens to some people, at least, is they either experience a certain degree of cognitive dissonance, or they feel like they believe something that's slightly silly or something like that. So then they have to kind of find arguments which entail the conclusion that God exists, which they hold on completely different grounds, and then provide those as if the reason that they are a Christian and believe those things is the upshot of like this series of derivations, right? Like just one day they were kind of sitting around in their lounge and they were reflecting on things. They thought, everything that begins to exist seems to have a cause of its existence. And, they could, the universe probably
they just woke up
exist.
contemplating the ontological argument. They're like, oh, shoot,
Exactly.
God exists, my bad.
Yeah, and that just commits me to the conclusion that God exists. I sort of think that the arguments kind of come later to a whole bunch of other things that are going on. And then within online spaces and offline spaces, there's this whole kind of discourse, I suppose, between people who are apologists and people who represent other sort of kingdoms, I guess I'm going to call them, of like certain atheist communities, or perhaps like philosophy of religion communities, whatever. And the people who are in these different communities are kind of engaging in the discourse in different ways. And the ostensibly Christian communities, the way that they're engaging in the discourse is, through this paradigm of presenting like a series of arguments, from which it follows that God exists, that doesn't. And yeah, I guess there's a lot of things that I see. I guess it can make sense for certain forms of Christianity why you do that, right? If you think that that's going to convince people, I suspect that what it mostly does is for people who perhaps are kind of new to Christianity, or maybe they're not new, but they're thinking about the kind of content of their theology for the first time, and they might be experiencing doubts. I suspect that these kind of engagements serve to do away with some of the cognitive dissonance. Perhaps they kind of either reduce people's doubts, or they add some flesh on the bones of propositions that they just hadn't thought about before. And so they can watch someone like William Lane Craig, debate someone who's supposed to be like a leading authority of the atheist community. And William Lane Craig might provide them with ideas they can now kind of assent to and agree to, that are going to be like, yeah, these are good reasons to believe. And they can also be like, and I'm really confident that those reasons also rebut the best atheist positions, because I've seen a debate where that happened. And I think that that's the work that apologetics is potentially doing. Of course, occasionally it converts someone. And then I think there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of like marketing. There's a lot of like public prophilicity, which is something that Hans Georg Moore talks about quite a lot. So it's sort of the idea of like being an influencer and appealing to the general peer or marketing, your kind of brand in a certain way. And that takes place in the apologetic spaces as well. It's kind of inevitable for everyone online that they're going to do this to some degree. But I think there's something about the apologetic space that I dislike about that, which is the kind of profiles that people build to appeal to the kind of general Christian peer seem kind of disingenuous in some way. That kind of rubs me up the right, because I enjoy. Well, one thing is because it seems like people are talking about doing one thing, which is sincerely seeking the truth, while doing something that's completely different, such as marketing slogans and stereotyping people who disagree with them and so forth. And also avoiding sincere conversations about the issues at hand. And those sorts of things kind of really frustrate me about apologetics in general. So yeah, I've said a lot there. I don't know if there's anything, it might be like trying to hammer Jello to a wall or whatever, because I've said so much. But if there's one thing that stuck out that you wanted to pick me up on, or...
Yeah, there's a couple things. So I wrote down two things as you were talking, Nathan. One was one thing I totally agreed with you with, and one is maybe I'm disagree with. So to start with, like the agreement, I think you're totally right. In the beginning, you talked about like the religious nature of like often with conversion. It's not usually just, a lot of times apologetics or things like that isn't involved in conversion. And I think you're most generally right. Because I think about a lot of people that I know that are Christians. For a lot of them, their conversion isn't the result of like studying like the Kalam cosmological argument or like the case of the resurrection. It's something more experiential or emotional or things like this, which in my mind isn't a bad thing. And I don't think you would say that either. It's just sometimes you're right. I think you're right about this idea that oftentimes a religious conversion is not with regards to just like studying arguments. And like, I think that's the way it probably should be. Like I think about in the book of James, where it talks about like pure religion in verse 127 is like to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unstained from the world. It's not pure religion is studying the works of Thomas Aquinas. I guess he didn't exist when the book of James was written. But like, I think that like there's something to this where if we're just doing like apologetics the whole time and missing like this experiential carrying out your faith, like actually like loving on people in your community or the people around you, you're really missing out on something if you're a Christian. So I'm speaking to Christians there. So something I really agree with you with is that religion shouldn't just be, especially as a Christian, just about like apologetics and like trying to like make these arguments as good as possible. And like, I think there are good arguments. So I disagree with you there. The thing I would disagree with you on, and after this, feel free to comment wherever you see fit, is I think that there's a little bit more meat to apologetics than just trying to like maybe like reinforce faith. So like, for example, I'm very convinced that like the worldview of Christianity is true. And to me, I think about, well, if Christianity is true, then they'd probably be able to find some sort of like epistemic support for it through maybe like arguments or things like that. And then I look around the world and I think about like natural theology and things. And I think there are like good arguments for God. And these can be things that kind of like strengthen your faith almost. Like you'd say like, hey, I have this like experiential, like religious side where there's something really real to this. But you could also look and say, hey, in this other field of maybe like the sciences or like philosophy or whatnot, there is this like thing that seems to support my belief. And I think that's a good thing. I don't really see that as a bad thing because I see it as like different like realms of evidence from different kind of spheres supporting like the same like structure. It's kind of how I see it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on anything I just said.
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting discourse. I mean, a lot of what I do, I occasionally kind of comment on the kind of content of the arguments and stuff. But I think the reason why a lot of what I do appeals to people on both sides is because I like to step out of that and talk about the matter of the discussion and talk about the discourse as a whole. And I think that kind of points out some kind of like ironies and things that are taking place there. So I agree. There's probably I can name I think a few people who are Christians for whom this genuinely is just them kind of exploring something that's intellectually interesting from their point of view. And it's almost like, I don't want to say detached from their faith, because obviously the kind of beliefs that they form influence the kind of theology that they have or how they might conduct themselves in church or whatever, because that's going to modify their belief structure. But in another sense, it is just this kind of intellectual activity on one side, and their faith and religion and stuff is kind of a bit removed from it. But I think for a lot of the people who are apologists in the online spaces, really is connected to either resolving cognitive dissonance that they themselves experience, or kind of pandering to an audience that is experiencing that and kind of trying to market Christianity, essentially, like kind of being Christianity's PR team, and trying to present a narrative about the state of the discourse and what Christianity is and so forth, in order to resolve those doubts for people. And I think that that's a big swathe of what Christians do. I mean, to think of a specific example, one would be like Cameron's reasons for getting into apologetics were because his brother was doubting, and then he wanted to then find, good reasons to be a Christian to persuade his brother. And then I think he got into, having some of these online conversations and things. Then he got into kind of inviting people on, and like philosophers to discuss their arguments, or to host little debates either between YouTubers or philosophers. And I think that while now he's moving more in a direction of interviewing more scholars, I think for a long time, a lot of what his channel has been about has been kind of like marketing sort of memes and creating these kind of system one stereotypes almost for people who are Christians who are struggling with doubts, or struggling to kind of view Christianity as an intellectually viable option in a culture where a lot of people, or an increasing number of people, it's slightly different in the US, I suppose, to over here, because the vast majority of people are still Christians, but where an increasing number of people kind of don't believe in the kind of core propositions of Christianity, or where the kind of entities that make up Christian theology don't do a lot of work in people's everyday lives and so on. So a hostile environment. And I think that a lot of kind of Cameron's efforts have gone into producing these kind of like stereotype type memes that people almost have in their mind, and you'll see them come up in comment sections, or in live chats, where people, rather than people being able to like genuinely talk to each other, you just see these kind of like mimetic talking points come up, and people struggling to really engage with each other, because the discourse has been presented as this thing right to one side. And I'd accuse atheists of the same thing. I mean, I see a lot of terrible points from people who are atheists, and I can clearly tell that they're part of a particular atheist community, right, where the discourse is presented as a certain thing. So people who subscribe to that discourse have like, like a set kind of belief structure that they're going to present to people that involves like a bunch of claims that might not actually be good, good reasons to be an atheist. That, and maybe I'll say like a lot of those people perhaps watch like the Atheist Experience and so on, right? And I just kind of dislike that. I think there are more productive conversations to be had around religion, but the problem is that you kind of can't have. I don't think that you can actually have the authentic conversations across boundaries, and maintain some of the kind of effects that certain kind of apologetics YouTube channels want to have. For example, if Frank Turek began to humanize the people that he talked to, right, rather than have them as like dumb college kids who are influenced by liberalism and don't believe in truth or something, then all of a sudden it would be more difficult for him to create 10-second sound bites of him doing like gotchas on them to show how dumb like what the world believes is. Because that's kind of the discourse he's presenting to his audience, is like, look how dumb the world is without the Christian worldview. And if he instead like sat down and approached people, the students that he's talking to as humans, explored their belief structure, it's just more difficult to kind of have them as like, these blue-haired weirdos who like say something dumb, and then he just goes, "Is that true?" And everyone goes like, "Yeah."
Yeah, there's a couple of things that are valuable in what you said, Nathan. What is, I think that going back to what you said, like we have like the idea of like the like apologetic, like intellectual sphere, and then like the religious sphere, and how they don't oftentimes like intermix. I think they can sometimes, and I'm sure you would agree. Like, I'm not saying anything you disagree with. I was just thinking about like in my own experience. I was reading this book. It's a recent book that just came out called like Religious Experience and the Knowledge of God, something like that, by Harold Netland, and he talked about how something along the lines of like. He's not full on Plantingan with regards to like epistemology, but like how you can have like Christianity is true, we can expect to have like genuine like religious experiences with things like sunsets or sunrises. Like I always experience like sunrises as I go into work, and I was thinking about his book, and I was like, well, if Christianity is true as I think it is, then I'm experiencing God through the sunset. So there's something there, and I think these two can kind of intertwine. But I think the big point I wanted to get on, and where I think you're right, is this idea of like the importance of having like good discourse. I don't really know about the specific examples you talk about because I don't spend a lot of time like in those chats or comments or whatever. But I do think you're right that like oftentimes we're so tribalistic and we have our talking points. And I think like you can see this in especially like the American like political sphere and really just like any other debate. Oftentimes it's like reduced to like the talking points. You're like, oh, I've seen this a million times. And there's something really important about like genuine discourse, which is why I've been trying to have people like you and other non-Christians on my channel more recently, because I think it's a lot better when you just have that conversation versus like when you're going like back and forth on Twitter or like whatever, because Twitter's where all the high intellectuals have their debates. So I think there's something really valuable in like having conversations like this because it helps improve the discourse. And I'd hope for people listening, you can see like you can have conversations, not just be like super tribalistic and be like, but Nathan, Calambro, Hilbert's Hotel, like what are you doing? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the old kind of format of debates and so forth as well. The problem is that once people kind of cotton on to the tricks that people are using to avoid genuine objections and so forth, that again has this massive backfire effect for people who begin to make those observations because they feel like they've had the wool pulled over their eyes by people who are using either the constraints of debate or sort of linguistic tricks and things to avoid actually engaging with difficulties for their view, or kind of sincerely exploring what's true. That seems more like the kind of classical understanding of sophism, right, than anything else.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. And I've been growing, like I've done some debates in the past and there's some things I've said, I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I say that? I mean, because your views change in 3 or 4 years. And I'm sure you know that. But I think there's something a lot better about conversations than debates because you can actually like explore and like press on like certain issues. Because I think about like certain debates, and this is nothing against Craig, but I think about like all his debates he's done. And I don't think he really ever, except for maybe the Stephen Law debate, talked about the problem of animal suffering. And it's a very big problem. And it's nothing against Craig. It's just sometimes in like those strict debate formats, like those big issues that a lot of people are thinking about, they're just not brought up. So there's beauty in just having like conversations. So just to agree with what you said. So maybe then at this point, Nathan, do you think there are like any good arguments for the existence of God? Like where are you with regards to like God and arguments and things like that?
I think it depends what you mean by a good argument, right? I mean, my take is that a good argument is something that should persuade someone who doesn't agree with the conclusion of the truth of that conclusion.
Yeah.
And I tend not to think that there are very many good arguments, if there are any at all, on that basis. I mean, one observation to make might be, firstly, how long these conversations have been going on for. Pretty much the structure of the arguments is very similar. I mean, you can read passages in Cicero that are basically the same as the fine-tuning argument and so forth. Obviously, things have changed a bit, and there's a bit of difference, and philosophy has changed, and different models of logic are used, and so on. But a lot of the stuff is very similar. A lot of the objections are basically the same. And there's still widespread disagreement amongst people. And it tends to be the case that people basically find the arguments convincing that surprisingly support the conclusion that they already agreed to. This is going to be a broader objection to the use of arguments and standards of success in philosophy. I mean, I find the exact same things when it comes to other philosophical topics like consciousness or whatever. Funnily enough, the people who find like Mary's room a convincing argument are the people who already thought there was something kind of like special or non-physical about consciousness. The people who are physicalists like find a premise to object to or reasons wrong with it. And so I just kind of I'm very skeptical about arguments. I mean, often there's going to be at least one like a deductive argument. There's going to be at least one premise that someone objects to who disagrees with the conclusion. Even if there isn't, then someone might say, well, I'm just more confident of the conclusion than I am of any of these premises that you presented with me, so I'm just going to go away and think about it and then reject one. I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. You might kind of catch someone in a kind of reductio situation. In that case, then again, they can just go away and modify their beliefs. And I do think that the kind of Oppian, the Oppie response of, well, what we should actually do to have good philosophical discussions around this is just talk about the best theories that embed the contentious claim here and compare those theories to one another. I do think there are downsides to that approach, which could be that the actual standards that you're using for theory comparison could be different between the belief structures, and that would be an issue, right? Because if the best theory that embeds, atheism is true, or says different things about what the theoretical virtues are than the best theory that says theism is true, well, then it's going to be, you're kind of almost going to get in the precept position right there. And there's a conversation to be had. But I think there are good, from the point of view of someone who's a theist, right? I think there are going to be good arguments in the sense that there are going to be, propositions that the theist agrees are true that taken together entail that God exists. And so they're going to say, well, of course, even like it's sort of like you said about looking at a sunset, right? I think all of our perception, according to the position I hold, is theory laden. So as you kind of interpret your experience and what's going on, there's probably going to be like a set of interpretations of that experience that jointly entail, like God exists or is interacting with me in the sense of stuff. I think that makes sense. The problem is, why should someone who sort of doesn't share your web of beliefs, right, agree to any of that as you kind of present it to them? I mean, obviously they should agree that that's what you believe, but like, should they then kind of just completely abandon what they believe? I'm suspect about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like, I wouldn't say like to like an atheist, like, dude, I had this experience with the sunset. See, obviously God exists. Like, I wouldn't say that at all, because I think you're totally right, and I think that's why you have to get into every person is different, because you're gonna have that combination of maybe like your intellectual side of like studying, or like maybe like your intellectual thoughts about God, even like before like studying like apologetics or philosophy. Because I think a lot of people like think about like the existence of God from an intellectual perspective, even without knowing like any of the arguments. Like for me, like way before I even knew like William Lane Craig was a human being, I think about like I go to bed and I'd be like, well, why is there something rather than nothing? And like if God, and this is when I was like Christian, I was like, well, if God exists, it makes sense that there's something, but if God doesn't, like why would there be something? And this is before I studied anything on anyone or watched any videos with regards to this topic. So I think a lot of people are thinking about these things, even if they don't have the right words for that. Like I was like, oh, that's like a version of the cosmological argument now. So there's that. And then there's something else I was going to say, and I'm just totally losing my train of thought right here.
Well, I can say something on that point. I definitely agree with you that I mean, it's been a part of my experience as well that people think about these things. Something that I would want to note though is that I have this kind of skepticism about the reach of pure reason, as it were, right? That this idea that our concepts about these things are kind of going to be these kind of unfiltered a priori, the way that the concept really is in and of itself, kind of thing. So, something that I've realized, or at least something that I've come to believe, right, is the upshot of some of my kind of doubts is just how much being raised in a Christian or post-Christian community really influences all of the thoughts that I have pertaining to, like what God is, my thinking about like why the universe might exist and so forth. So when I reflect upon my experiences of thinking about those sorts of questions, I think rather than interpreting that through the lens of this is because, the propositions that make up like a contingency argument or something are kind of there just waiting to be discovered through pure reason. I think it's maybe more the influence of either Christian theology and like popular culture and films, or, like the kind of things that were talked about in assemblies and hymns that make up my understanding of what God is. And if I were kind of raised by the Piraha in the Amazon or the Sentinelese on the island, whatever, I don't even know if they actually, have a word for God, but assuming they did, I don't know that I would even necessarily think, the type of thing it would do is create, or I'm just kind of, I think a lot of these things are very culturally contingent and conditioned, like our concepts about these things.
Yeah.
I, yeah.
No, is there anything you want to say before
I was only going to say, and I think Josh Rasmussen actually agreed with me on this, because he was saying in a conversation about the contingency argument once, he was like, yeah, so, the foundation of reality, well, it would be, I just don't think it would be this kind of thing. I think it would be this kind of thing. A comment that I left was something to do with, imagine you were kind of raised in that region of China where they have the myth about the Laoshu turtle, right? Perhaps you would be inclined to think, well, the foundation of reality is the kind of thing that would share certain properties in common with like certain turtley properties, right? Like, wouldn't that just be more plausible to you because of the culture that you were socialized into? And he agreed with me on that point. And I think we just should be suspicious of where some of these concepts come from, rather than thinking we're accessing like capital T truth.
Well, there's a couple of things that are super important here to think about. One is maybe a more historical point. It's interesting because I was thinking about this idea of like the concept of God and things like this. Like, is it a localized idea? So I was doing some research for a paper I had to write for university on like the idea of like a supreme being or like a monotheistic God almost in Africa. And it seemed like through my research, like a lot of like ancient Africans believed in a supreme being that was kind of like the head of like their pantheon. There's a great dissertation. It was written in the 70s by a guy from the University of Chicago. I'm not finding the name right now. And he talked about this idea that like throughout a lot of these tribes, what you find is the idea of obviously all their other gods, but the idea of like a supreme being that was the creator of the universe. Usually they would say something like he was like perfect or something like this, but a lot of times they wouldn't say he was super involved in the world. So I would say, just to push back a little, I think that concept might be a little wider found, but that's a historical point, and I'm not super well versed in history. That's just kind of what I understand. But the thing I think you were talking about earlier with regards to like interpreting like that sunset experience, and I think like how much can we know through human reason? I think our worldviews are super important here. Like if we think of like the worldview of like Christianity or like theism, where there's a belief in like a supreme God, a perfect God, and it's like maybe like perfectly rational, and say that like he creates us, then I think we'd expect that like we'd be able to come to a lot of truth with regards to like rationality, like coming to understand like the nature of like the foundation of the world. So if God exists, I think we would have a good reason to think we could discover these things. But like if God doesn't exist, and we're just like evolved primates who just like come over a lot of time, then we probably wouldn't expect to be able to understand a lot of things. Like I remember very clearly, I was listening to the Graham Oppie on the When Belief Dies podcast. I remember exactly where I was when I heard this because it was super like impactful for me. He was talking about the argument from reason, and he said he's kind of willing to say like, yeah, our reason capacities kind of suck because we're evolved primates and we're going to get a lot of things wrong. And I'm from an atheistic worldview. That makes a lot of sense to me. Like I wouldn't expect our reason to be able to go very far under like an atheistic worldview. So I think understanding like how much we can know through reason is probably going to be largely contingent on like our worldviews and how we think about like our position in the universe and things like that. So sorry, I just threw a lot at you, but that's just kind of
it's absolutely fine
as you were talking.
What one problem that I kind of have with these lines of reasoning is it sort of depends on kind of what you specify in the hypothesis, right? Like, I tend to find that, and this is why I raised the point about the kind of cultural contingency of some of these beliefs that do get specified in the hypothesis, is even when we look at cross-cultural examples of supreme being belief and things like that, the kind of stipulations that theists who want to make these arguments about what's expected and so forth for the ways in which like a supreme being would act or the reasons they would have to act and so forth, those sorts of things are very theology dependent, like very, very specific on the theology. Because when I think about just bare theism, I think that for me, the probability space is basically equal to like just atheism. Like I have no idea that God might want to like create a universe with psychophysical laws that where very specific physical constants permit life. That being might want to create nothing. It might want to create a universe that pops in, does nothing. But what you can do is you can specify in the hypothesis some specific like reasons that God would have, or some specific theology about what that God values and so forth. That kind of then does give you and entail kind of what you want to get, right? Which is it desiring and wanting this universe. But the bare theism, I don't think does that. And So this is something I kind of I struggle with when these kind of arguments are made. Like I don't know why on bare theism, for example, a god would want to make people with reliable cognitive faculties. It might want to make people with like unreliable cognitive faculties, right? And then but then we can bring something, or it might want to just not create people at all. So then the very existence of beings with any cognitive faculties is evidence against, in a sense. And then another thing I would say to that as well is an issue with taking that view with the view that there is a hypothesis, right, where it's expected that beings like us would be created with reliable cognitive faculties. The problem is that then you're going to have to look at all of the cognitive biases and heuristics literature out there, right, which is a lot, and that's all going to have to count as evidence against that hypothesis being true as well, and I think would drive you to kind of favoring that hypothesis isn't true, given all of the problems and reasoning biases and so forth that there are. I think Eamon Tversky and Daniel Kahneman have done a lot of work on that stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The dissertation I was talking about, I just pulled it up while I was thinking about it. It's called, it's by Benjamin C. Ray, African High Gods, a study of the concept of a supreme being in 6 African societies. So it's a PhD dissertation from the University of Chicago in 1971. So that's that in case you want to know that.
An anthropology one? Or
I don't know the field. I don't have that listed right here. I just have the citation that I pulled up.
Yes,
so
I'll look into it because it sounds interesting. But I was just wondering if you knew what like field he was doing that for.
I'm not sure. I mean, I know like when I like skim read the dissertation I was going, he talked about like, here's this tribe and here was all their religious beliefs. Here's how the supreme being fit into their beliefs. And that's kind of like the general schema of it. We went through like 6 different ones. So that's the general scheme. So I won't really say anything about like the divine psychology thing, just because I don't want to go too far down that route. I'd encourage people though, if you want to hear, like I had Apologetics Squared and we did a response to Nathan and James when they did the fine tuning. And one of your guys' big objections, and I think it's a really valuable one, and one that should be used more because I think it's really helpful, is the idea of like this divine psychology objection. We did a response to them on that. So I'd encourage you to check that out. You can just look it up, like Apologetics Squared, Adherent Apologetics, fine tuning, something like that. So you can find that if you want to see like kind of what what Squared thinks. He did most of the work there on that. So anything else you want to say on that topic, Nathan, before we get into like the final?
Yeah, I can think of. I can think of one good example actually to kind of illustrate the point that I'm making about pure reason. I mean, but perhaps you'd agree that something like the natural numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on are sort of like like a prime example of something that would be innate, like an access through pure reason or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree.
And one problem for that is that like cultures like the Paraha, for example, have just no concept of the natural numbers. They just don't. I think they don't count above like 2 or 3, and even there's really interesting discourse. Daniel Everett, I think, is the guy who did the research around this, but just really interesting discourse about like the way that their language functions and so on. And I mean, this gets into a broader discussion about the way that language works and a kind of view of like picture theories of language, which I object to. The idea being, I think what we have a tendency to do is reify the language that we're socialized into and think that the meanings are like these mental propositions that are then shared between languages, and different languages like express the same propositions and so forth. And that's sort of not my view of language. And I think that the Paraha are a good example of why that isn't true. There's lots of other examples, sort of like like in Russian, where you might say brick reds, for example, and there's like no copula to do work in the proposition, or different like shades of blue and things like that in different languages. But the point that I want to raise is I just think we should be kind of like skeptical of certain things where we think we're accessing like a pure cognitive kind of content meaning of something, like the numbers, right? And then you might do arithmetic operations or proofs about the properties of all the natural numbers, and think this has got to be something that is really true, like this a priori truth. Whereas for someone who's in like the Praha culture, where they just haven't been socialized into doing the actions that we do when we talk about counting and doing maths and so forth, they don't share those a priori truths. They have like a completely different conception of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Okay. I don't really want to push back.
Sorry. Don't.
And if
you don't know about the case, yeah.
And I think once again, all I'd say for now is I reaffirm the point of like the worldviews, like how we interpret these things can be largely dependent on our worldviews and like our presuppositions and all these things. And I'm not a presuppositional apologist, by the way, to anyone listening on Nathan's side of things, just so you know. So
I'm interestingly close to presuppositionalism, which is right. I just have a criticism of the way that they present, like then they think they've got an argument, right, which bridges that gap, and I think there's an issue with that. But
yeah. So maybe the last thing to talk about here, Nathan, is like, what's your biggest problem you have with Christianity? So one thing that I'm thinking about, like, what's the biggest thing, like maybe like holding you back from becoming a Christian? And maybe if there's something else you want to say with regards to like maybe like more like the culture of Christianity or something like that, because I know you talk a lot about that as well. So where are you with that?
I'm just trying to think of like the like one biggest reason. I think
it's hard because like it's usually not just one thing that's holding you back. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's difficult for me to think of, like what is the best, like what's the clearest sort of illustration, right, that I could make of what my problem is. And I'm not kind of sure. I think it's going to be something along the lines of, okay, for everything, in terms of reasons for believing that God exists, right? God's going to be put forward as a sort of explanation of some feature of reality. And so if you listen to a theist sort of object to an atheist worldview, they'll say all sorts of things like, well, how do you get from fundamental particles consciousness? Why does the universe exist? How do you get something out of nothing? All, these sorts of sound bites. But my general kind of finding with theists, even at kind of the academic level, is that their responses to a lot of these things are kind of like, well, it's God, right? God explains that. But there's just this kind of like word God and this assumption that does some work there. But I actually find that it tends not to explain anything any better than if you just kind of say something like, well, nature has a mysterious disposition to produce universes out of nothing, right? I mean, I don't believe the universe began to exist, but suppose I did. Or nature has a mysterious disposition, right, for consciousness to supervene on. It just becomes this kind of description of the phenomena that you're trying to explain, but it's not informative. There's no empirical content. There's all these kind of like problems basically with it as an explanation, in a sense that there wouldn't be problems for like other things that are good explanations, like maybe atomic theory or Charles's law or something as an explanation of something. And so yeah, I just think they're basically on a par, right? And so I can't find good reasons to kind of motivate viewing God as the explanation of any of these things. I'm going to say that's the main reason, and there's others I could draw in there, but I think that's the main one philosophically.
Yeah, it's helpful. Well, thanks, Nathan, so much for like coming on today. I really enjoyed like this conversation. Do you have anything else you want to say with regards to? We covered a lot of ground here. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up here?
No, that's it. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for inviting cross borders discussion and for asking me a bunch of questions.
Yeah, and I enjoyed this conversation, and I'm really hoping to have more cross borders conversations in the future. And anytime you want to talk, let me know, and we'll try to work something out. And yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's hopefully really helpful and edifying to people as they listen to this. Is something you can use to serve you and just like pursuing truth. And obviously we carry a lot of things with us, but just trying to help us remember, like, we're all like human beings at the end of the day, and we can still like love each other and have conversations, even if we like totally disagree on everything. There's something beautiful about that. So thank you so much for coming on, Nathan. Really enjoyed this. To all the people in the future listening to this, Nathan's YouTube channel is added, or for me, it will be added on that description thing. So just be at Digital Gnosis. Go subscribe. Great content there, and I really enjoy what Nathan's doing. And yeah, that's it. Obviously, if you're new here, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all those fun things. No new patrons, I think, since the last time. But if you want to support our show, you can come to Patron at patreon.com/Apologetics. But yeah, thank you so much, Nathan, for coming on. Really enjoyed this. And one last time, yeah, just thank you. Can't say thank you enough. So I'll just keep saying thank you. Awesome. Well, have a good one, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe and have a good one.